We're going to come tonight to another division, still under worship in the Old Testament, but notice from your outline, the sacred seasons. We trust the Lord can shed some light on what is a very complex aspect of the Old Testament dealing with the various sacred seasons, such as Passover, Pentecost, Feast of Tabernacles, and I don't know if you're aware of it, but people are always talking about the Sabbath, but there were many Sabbaths in the Old Testament. And in Colossians 2, Paul speaks of the Sabbaths, plural, being nailed to the cross. And so, again, studying the sacred seasons will help you better to interpret or understand the New Testament. By your understanding the Sabbaths of the Old Testament, then when we deal with that in our studies in Colossians on Sunday night, in Colossians 2, you'll have a knowledge of what we're talking about, or what Paul is talking about. I suppose most Christians would be hard put to explain why Paul said Sabbaths in the plural in Colossians 2. So you'll see tonight that there are many Sabbaths. There was the weekly Sabbath, and of course, that's the one most people think about. We're going to try to follow the outline pretty carefully here. The designations of the sacred seasons. I'll just give you the designations first of all, and then we'll deal with them. First of all, there is the weekly Sabbath. Now, the weekly Sabbath in Hebrew, as well as pronunciation today in Israel, is Shabbat. That's S-H-A-B-B-A-T in modern Hebrew, Shabbat. Our classical Hebrew is Shabbath. It's S-H-A-B-B-A-T. For those who write Hebrew, there it is on the board. S-H-A-B-B-A-T, Shabbat. That's the weekly Sabbath. Then there are lesser Sabbaths that we'll mention later. You might just want to put it down for completeness' sake. There are lesser Sabbaths. This is the high Sabbath on the seventh day. We're just giving the designations. The Sabbath are Sabbaths, plural. The new moons, they're new moons, plural. Every month was a new moon, of course, but there's a seventh month new moon. And a third category are the three pilgrimage feasts. Three pilgrimage feasts. Now, we read about these things all the time in the Old Testament as well as the New, and it's very hard to get them all cataloged and put together in the right order. That's what we're trying to do for you, first of all. The three pilgrimage feasts, pilgrimage means they had to make a pilgrimage up to the tabernacle or temple of Jerusalem. At these three feasts are the Passover, first of all, Passover, Pentecost, and Feast of Tabernacles. Now, all of the feasts, again, like the sacrifices, relate to Christ and New Testament truth, as we'll get to in due time. And then a fourth category, the seventh month. The seventh month. We're talking about the sacred seasons, Sabbaths, new moons, pilgrimage festivals. The fourth category, the seventh month. And that included three feasts. The Feast of Trumpets, sometimes called the Day of Trumpets, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Tabernacles, which we've already mentioned under pilgrimage feasts, but here's where it goes in the seventh month. Day of Trumpets, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles. That was quite a bit to do in the seventh month. Then another category is the sabbatical year. Sabbatical year, every seventh year was sacred. You notice how the number 7 just keeps creeping in. Sabbatical year. And then last category is the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee, which is every 7th sabbatical year, which would make that 7 times 7, or the 50th year. It's after the 7th sabbatical year. Now we'll be looking at the texts as we come to them, but I'll give you the texts where the laws are, and then we'll look at them later. Exodus 23, Leviticus 23 to 25, and chapter 27, Numbers 28 and 29, Deuteronomy 15 and 16. Now, there are more passages, but those are just the major ones where you have whole chapters dealing with the feasts and the sacred seasons. Now, what is their significance? Well, the general designation of the sacred seasons, of course, they're not called sacred seasons in the Old Testament, but they're called an appointed time. An appointed time. For those who want the Hebrew, it's called a moed. M-O long E-D. Moed. Moed, which means a sacred season, or an appointed time. Numbers 28:2 is where the word occurs, as an appointed time. God said, these are appointed times, and here's the way I want you to observe them. We're talking about the meaning and purpose of the sacred seasons, and I'll give you both of these. The holy days are the sacred seasons with the purpose on the one hand to preserve by these seasons a remembrance of Israel's election and deliverance. That's what it would remind them of, first of all, that God by these seasons would preserve in Israel's life a memory of her election and deliverance, literal deliverance. And then on the other hand, it would be a constant reminder of their constant dependence upon God for all earthly blessing and prosperity. It would also remind them of their continual dependence upon God for blessing and prosperity. See, these feasts are built, so many of them, around like Pentecost, the harvest, and Passover would be deliverance, and so it would be reminding them of these things. And there were so many Sabbaths and holy days and sacred seasons, like with the great variety of sacrifice and offerings, she was constantly being reminded 7 days a week that she was God's people, separated unto God and holy. She had been elected, chosen out of all the nations of the earth. God had no other people before the cross, as the Bible clearly teaches. God had not only delivered her, but given her a land, and everything that she grew on it or raised, a tenth was God's, and so on, as we told you last week. Continually, Israel was being reminded, one way or another, of her dependence upon God and her relationship to God and her separation from the world. And feasts and Sabbaths and sacrifices and so on were constant. Tithing. Every time a lamb was born, you see, they'd say, well, that's number 8. And then when number 10 comes around, that's God's. So in every way, she is reminded that she is a holy people. And of course, we are not to forget that either. We have other ways to be reminded. One of the ways is the Word of God, that we are not to neglect that much of the Bible, which God said, by that I want to remind you of my election, deliverance, and provision for you, just like with Israel. Now the celebration of the holy days we come to next. The celebration of the holy days. Now on the annual feast days, rest from all labor was commanded, as well as the weekly Sabbath. In other words, all of the yearly feast days were Sabbaths. They were Sabbaths, and they were called that. All of the yearly feast days, rest was commanded, just like the weekly Sabbath. Then you've got 2 feasts that last a week. That's Feast of Tabernacles and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the Passover. 2 festivals or feasts lasted a week, which would be Passover and Feast of Tabernacles. And the 1st and 7th day of the feasts were Sabbaths. See, every yearly festival or feast was a Sabbath, just like the weekly Sabbath. Then the 1st and last day, or 1st and 7th day, of the Passover feast, which was 7 days, and the Feast of Tabernacles, which was 7 days. The first and last days were Sabbaths. In other words, you had to rest. But there is one difference. On the weekly Sabbath and the Day of Atonement, which would be one of the yearly feasts, you see, or observances, on the weekly Sabbath and the Day of Atonement, all work was prohibited under the threat of death. You couldn't kindle a fire, cook, or do anything. The weekly Sabbath, Day of Atonement. But on all of the other Sabbaths, and remember there are many, rest only is required. But they could cook, and work would be permitted in those 2 feasts that lasted a week. You could work in between the 2 Sabbaths. The first and last days were Sabbaths, and you could work at your job in between, because the whole 7 days were not Sabbaths, just the first and last. Which clears up quite a mystery if you try to do much reading in the Old Testament about all of these Sabbaths and feasts. And it's not complicated once you understand it, that the yearly feasts and the weekly Sabbaths, all work prohibited. Be our Saturday. Then the other Sabbaths, rest only. Now the weekly Sabbath and the Day of Atonement are called Shabbaton, high Sabbaths. The same word, Shabbat, and then it's plural, Shabbaton. S-H-A-B-B-A-T, S-H-A-B-B-A-T-O-N. Shabbat, Shabbaton, the high day of rest, or the high Sabbath. Now the celebration of the weekly Sabbath and the sabbatical feast days are these holy convocations, these appointed times, and they're called by special term holy convocations. The weekly Sabbath, sabbatical feast days. And on the 3 festivals, all males were required to go up to Jerusalem, no exceptions. Only the males were required to go up. Like on the day of Pentecost when they received the baptism, and like at the Passover when Jesus went up, all males were required to go up to appear before the Lord. And that's Exodus 23 and Deuteronomy 16. Exodus 23 verses 14 and 17. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16. They were not to come before the Lord empty-handed. They had to bring their offerings and Deuteronomic tithes that we mentioned last week. After they gave a tenth, then they had to tithe the 9 tenths that were left. Well, this is when they'd bring that tenth of the 9 tenths that was left at the 3 festival feasts, among other offerings. Now the sabbatical seasons, with that kind of as a basis or foundation, we come to the sabbatical seasons. The weekly Sabbath, sabbatical year, year of Jubilee. Where is the origin of the Sabbath? Well, we have to go back to the creation account in Genesis. And if you turn to Genesis 1 and 2, actually chapter 2, but it's the whole creation account, there you will see God hallowing the 7th day. But as a legalistic Sabbath, or a Sabbath, let's say, of the law, the Adventists claim it begins here. And therefore, though the law is done away with, Sabbath, like tithing, is still for the Christian Sabbath observance, because it had its beginning here at the beginning of creation. But the creative account shows God hallowing a 7th day. Thus the heavens and earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day. Now that word rested is where we get the term Sabbath. It's not Shabbat, but it's the verb, Shavath, the verb to rest. To cease or to rest. It means to cease also. We could say he ceased his creative work on the 7th day from all the work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, that is, hallowed it, because that in it he had ceased or rested from all his work which God created and made. The word means to cease or rest. Now, the word Sabbath does not occur in this account or in the book of Genesis anywhere. It doesn't occur until Exodus when Moses gives the law. But certainly we're told here what is the basis for the later Sabbath. The Adventists claim it's law all the way back to the beginning, but of course it's not law there. It's just a statement that God rested and hallowed the seventh day. And in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11, we have the reason assigned for later observance of the Sabbath. That is, as a part of the law. In Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11, you've got the reason assigned for why God made this the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord thy God. It's a Sabbath of the Lord. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor any cattle, nor thy stranger that's within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested or ceased the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he hallowed it. He not only hallowed it, he blessed it, which means it's not something that was ever intended to be a burden, but a blessing. Even a blessing for the animals, the work animals, the horses and cattle or whatever. They were to rest on that day too. Animals need to rest also. Now there's no distinct mention of the Sabbath prior to the book of Exodus, but there are mentions of 7-day periods in the book of Genesis, which obviously is a reference to a 7-day week. I'll just cite those. We don't need to look them up. Genesis 7, verses 4 to 10. Genesis 8, verses 10 to 12. And Genesis 27 and following. We have a reference to 7-day periods. So obviously it's a week. That when God established creation in 6 days and rested or ceased on the seventh, that made a week, and that's the way he created everything, that it should be in cycles of 7. Again, a perfect number. He could have made an 8-day week if he wanted to, or a 3-day week or a 4-day week, as the labor unions are agitating for. But he made a 7-day week, and 1/7 of that week that he made is for rest and worship. But there's no Sabbath till we get to the law. The Sabbath is a part of the law. That's why over in Galatians 2, when Paul says he nailed the law, including the Sabbaths, to the cross, then he's nailing the law. Not the fact that we need a day of rest. We certainly do. But it's not a legalistic Sabbath. That started with the law. We'll deal in more detail in Colossians, but it's significant that you see these things because Adventists are very persuasive, and they know more about what they believe than the average Christian knows about what he believes or what he doesn't believe, for that matter. He doesn't know what he believes or what he doesn't believe. And Adventists can twist you around their little finger with their arguments, just like Jehovah's Witnesses. And especially the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the heart of Adventism. And so we need to see that when we get over to Colossians 2, he not only says the law was nailed to the cross, but he specifically mentions Sabbaths, plural, not singular. And so if you understand that the Sabbaths, even the word Shabbat is not used until the law, period. It's not in all of Genesis. All of that history, that's a long history. That's from the creation through the flood down through Jacob and the 70 sons going into Egypt, and then 400 years after that, Moses arises to deliver the people. That's many, many centuries. Then we have a Sabbath commandment. So that brings us the Sabbath in the Mosaic period. Now the first mention of the Sabbath is where? You say, we just read it, Exodus 20. So why didn't somebody say Exodus 20? But that isn't where it begins. So I'm glad you didn't. The first mention of the Sabbath is before the giving of the law, but is still in the Mosaic period, and it's Exodus 16, verses 21 to 30, which I'm sure you want to read with me. Exodus 16, verses 21 to 30. Here's the mention of the Sabbath before the law, the fourth commandment was given. It was actually mentioned. But yet we're still in the Mosaic period, the period of the law. Exodus 16, 21 to 30. Now this is in connection with the giving of the manna from heaven. Keep that in mind and it'll be clear to you. Well, we should start back at verse 16. This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded, gather of it every man according to his eating, and omer and so forth. And then verse 19, Moses said, let no man leave any of it till the morning. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left of it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was wroth with them. And they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating, and when the sun waxed hot, it melted. It came to pass that on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. He said unto them, this is that which the Lord hath said, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath, the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. See, the weekly Sabbath is going to be a high Sabbath. This is the first mention of it right here. It's the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you bake today, and seethe that which you will seethe, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. And they laid it up till the morning, as Moses bade them, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. And Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today you shall not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, the manna, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the 7th day for to gather, and they found none. And then the Lord said unto Moses, how long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath, therefore he giveth you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Abide ye every man in his place, and let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. In other words, God declared to Israel in the wilderness he was going to feed her supernaturally. And he would give them a double supply, he said, on the 6th day. Then on the 7th day there would be none. And those who disobeyed him, didn't gather enough, went out and didn't find any. And if they gathered too much on Wednesday, say, and had any left, they were supposed to throw it out, because if it didn't, it would breed worms. But on the 6th day, God again showing his supernatural power, they could gather twice as much and it would stay pure. It was a very delicate substance that was very tasty, but without refrigeration you couldn't keep it. God just supplied it each morning. But was the day already known, as some suggest? You notice here in verse 28. That the Lord said, how long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? Some say, well, the Sabbath was already known. See, this is before the giving of the law, the Sabbath commandment in chapter 20. And some say, well, the Sabbath's already known. I don't think you can prove it from that. It really doesn't matter too much one way or another, but the Adventists like to use it to say, see, the commandment was already known. How long will you violate my commandments by not observing the Sabbath, is what he's saying. But you see, they've been murmuring and disobedient all along. And so this is just adding more to their disobedience, and he's saying, how long will you not obey me? He doesn't say, how long will you not keep my Sabbath? So you really can't prove that they were observing a Sabbath until right here when the manna is given. Now that doesn't give all the technical legislation of the Sabbath keeping, which comes later in the law, but that just tells them to observe the 7th day because it's holy to God. So it's not the Sabbath that was nailed to the cross yet, because that comes later, and there's no proof, as I said, that they kept a Sabbath before this from this statement in verse 28. I've already explained it. Now a short time later, of course, it's given in Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11, which we've already read. And the purpose of the Sabbath is the obvious thing. Now, God didn't get tired when He created, so He wasn't resting, but it's still a figure or type of man's need of rest, and to have a day of worship, a day set aside for worship and rest. Man or beast, children, slaves, whatever, were not permitted to work. And the reason assigned, as we've already said, is because God rested or ceased, in His case, ceased from work on the seventh day. And there's not a hint in the Old Testament, that's a remarkable thing. There's not a hint in the Old Testament this was intended to be some legalistic burden, but a blessing. It's even called a blessing. In fact, we're permitted occasionally to turn to the New Testament, even though it's Old Testament theology. And for anyone who doesn't understand what we mean by that, we don't try to prove Old Testament theology from New Testament revelation. We show the usage in the Old Testament, how the Jew looked at it and what he thought, so that we can understand what context the New Testament is written in. You see, when Jesus came and started talking about Sabbaths and this and that and the other, the Jew didn't have Colossians 2 or deliverance from the law yet. So we have to think like Jews. We said that when we started out in Old Testament theology. And that's sufficient explanation. If it isn't, then get the beginning tapes. And we go into detail why you've got to think like a Jew if you're going to study Old Testament. Now, that doesn't mean what it may imply to some people, that you don't need the new. You certainly do. That's why you need to listen to the tapes. I don't want to have to repeat all that twice. But it helps you understand the new, because you can't apart from understanding the old. Yeah, explain to us the book of Hebrews if you don't know some of these things. Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 27. We're appealing to the New Testament to show you what Jesus said the purpose of the Sabbath was for. You see, he's still before the cross. This is still the Old Testament dispensation when he's speaking here. And of course, they're always harassing Jesus because they say he doesn't keep the Sabbath. So let's begin at verse 23. It came to pass that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of grain. There wasn't any corn then. Corn is from the American Indians. And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And he said unto them, Have you never read what David did when he had need and was hungered? He and they that were with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat, but for the priests, and gave also to them that were with him. Now look at this. And he said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. God never created man and said, now here's a law you've got to keep. I've got a Sabbath law. I made you so you could keep my law. No, the Son of God who gave the law to Moses before he became incarnate said, I made the Sabbath for man. In other words, it's a blessing. It's a time for rest and worship. So there's nothing clear about what the true attitude should be toward the Sabbath in the Old Testament dispensation, but that. It was never intended to be a burden, but a blessing. Do you understand? God made the Sabbath for man. He made the 7 days of the week for us. He made the first day of the week we celebrate because of resurrection. He made that day for us. He didn't make us for the day. Some people still observe days, you know. They're bound to days. Everything from Holy Fridays to Halloween. And they're both invented by man, remember. There's no Holy Friday in the Bible. You can't even get scholars to agree that he was crucified on a Friday. There's a lot of argument, good argument, for it being Thursday. And I challenge anybody to prove things that you can't prove where you're not given specific statements. He was 3 days and 3 nights in the grave, he said, as Jonah was in the belly of the whale. But if you don't know how the Jew figures his day, you don't have 3 days and 3 nights. You've got parts of 2 days. Hello out there. Are we talking to anybody that's ever done any study besides Sunday school lessons? This is a big question among people about when he was crucified. And so if you're going to observe Holy Fridays, how do you know it's a Friday? We know he arose on the first day of the week. And it's quite a question to try to figure out by our calendar today a lot of things in the Bible. All right, how about the Sabbath in the post-Mosaic period? After Moses, the early prophets and historians frequently mention the Sabbath. I'll just give you references. The early prophets and the historians mention the Sabbath again and again, like 2 Kings 4:23, Amos 8:5, Hosea 2:11, Isaiah 1:13, Ezekiel 46:3. Now those are real early and some not so early prophets, but all of those were pre-exilic I gave you, so it would be early in that sense. And then if you read Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, you'll see they attach many promises to the faithful observance of the Sabbath. Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel attach great promises to the Jews that will faithfully observe God's Sabbath. A few references: Jeremiah 17:21-27, Isaiah 56, 2-4, 58:13, Ezekiel 20, 12-24. And then the Sabbath in the post-exilic period. That was post-Mosaic. And then the post-exilic, that is after the exile. Now with the exile, we have the rise of the synagogue. And we'll get to that later in our study of Judaism, but this is where the synagogue begins, in the exile, during the period of the exile. There's no synagogue. They go into captivity, and when they come out of captivity, we've got synagogues in history, so that has to be where it began. See, there's no synagogue in the Old Testament teaching, and we'll get to the purpose and all of that later in another study. But with the development of the synagogue, then the Sabbath took on additional meaning. It was not only a special day of worship and rest, as it had always been, but now there was a study of the Scriptures. So you don't find that till you get into the synagogue. As we said a long time ago, the stress in the Old Testament is upon ritual. God was teaching them by pictures and so forth. Sacrifices is what we mean by pictures. And the holy days and all of these other things. And there was a reading of the law on certain feast days where they would gather before the tabernacle and they would read the whole law. That was quite a few hours, standing, if you please, in a Palestinian sunshine. But there was no real teaching of the law. See, teaching is something really peculiar to the church for all of the obvious reasons. But it had its rise in the synagogue. And then when Jesus and Paul come along, of course, they're teachers. And so the Sabbath becomes a time for the study of the law. And during this period, the same period, from Ezra and Nehemiah on through to the time of Matthew or Christ, during this period is when you have your rise of all of your legalistic regulations which govern the Jewish life and worship. Just loads of things tacked upon the Sabbath, which made it a burden. And Jesus came, remember, teaching that there were so many burdens they couldn't even bear them themselves, the Pharisees who taught them. So here we have the legalistic aspect of the Sabbath coming in. It's not legalistic up until the time between the Testaments. Then all of a sudden, it goes from a day that's a blessing, a day of rest and so forth, and even study of the Scriptures, to a very legalistic thing. And if you'll study this whole area of legalism, you'll find what Jesus was confronted with And it was destroying the very purpose for which he instituted the Sabbath. Outside of his claims to be the Messiah, there was nothing that aroused the wrath of the Jews against Jesus more than his observance of the Sabbath. All through the Gospels, as you know without me telling you, over and over, they want to destroy him because he breaks the Sabbath. For example, to give you one example of many, John 5. We said outside of his claims to be the Son of God and Messiah, there's nothing that aroused their wrath and hostility more than his failure to observe their legalistic Sabbath the way they did. Like he healed a man on the Sabbath day, said, take up your bed and walk, and that instituted opposition against him. And he healed a man with a withered arm, and we read how that they would follow him around, the leaders, to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Remember, we're told that. And he said, remember one time, why, if your ox falls into the ditch on the Sabbath, you lift him out. Should I not make a man every whit whole on the Sabbath? So Sabbath controversy was a big thing in Jesus' ministry. John 5, verses 8 and 9. And Jesus said to the man, that he healed, rise up, take up thy bed and walk. And immediately the man was made whole and took up his bed and walked. Now notice, we're told, and on the same day it was a Sabbath. You see, because the one thing outside his claims to be Son of God, the one thing that brought about his crucifixion was the Sabbath question. And of course he had to bring about his crucifixion. They were looking for trouble, and he gave them trouble in that sense. They were looking for something to destroy him about, and you see him more than once antagonizing on purpose the Jews by the way he does things. See, like he could have healed him on Friday. He'd been there. We're told he'd been lying there for I don't know how long, and said every time the water's stirred by the angels, somebody rushes in ahead of me and gets healed. And he's been coming there for years. But he purposely would heal on the Sabbath to show that it's right to do good on the Sabbath. That's what he kept telling them. And the Jews, verse 10, said unto him who was cured, it's the Sabbath. It's not lawful for thee to carry thy bed, thy pallet. It was just a bedroll, He answered them, he that made me whole, the same said unto me, take up thy bed and walk. Had he not done that, you see, on the Sabbath, he wouldn't have been healed, would he? He'd say, well, I can't move today, Jesus, but I believe you've healed me, and tomorrow will be Sunday, the first day of the week, and I believe it'll happen. I hope. Well, he said, what man told you to take up your bed and walk on the Sabbath? He said, well, I don't know who he was. He conveyed himself away in a multitude. Verse 14, afterward Jesus findeth him in the temple and said unto him, behold, thou art made whole, sin no more, lest a worse thing befall thee. And the man departed and said to the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him. That's what they thought about healing a man on the Sabbath, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. But Jesus said unto them, my Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because not only had he broken the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So, the Sabbath was big in Jesus' ministry, as you can see. It's why they crucified him, for two reasons. One, he said he was Son of God, making himself equal with God. The other was the violation in their eyes of the Sabbath. Of course, you follow that reasoning, why David would have had to have been put to death because it was unlawful to eat the showbread. And he did when he was hungry. And Jesus said, well, God didn't make man for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. And therefore, when a person has a need, then a law, which is simply something on a printed page or carved in stone, the law is not to take precedence, but the need of the person. So even in the Old Testament, you see, not all things were absolute. If there was a human need, why sometimes that Jesus said could take precedence. Then the eschatological Sabbath means, of course, what it implies, the end time Sabbath. There's a Sabbath in prophecy. Sabbath in prophecy. And it seems to have two aspects. First, there is the cessation of the Sabbath for Israel in this age of grace and her rejection. That is from God's side. Their Jews still observe the Sabbath, but God isn't listening to their worship because they're outside Christ. So there will be a cessation of the Sabbath in the age of grace. That's Hosea 2:11 as punishment of Israel, part of her punishment. Hosea 2:11, I will also cause all thy mirth to cease. I will cause Israel's feasts and her new moons and her Sabbaths and all of her solemn assemblies to cease. Now, to be sure, we know that they were restored to their land in 1947, and they observed the Sabbath. You go over there in Israel, it's the Sabbath on Saturday. You'll find out quick enough. We know that all down through history, Orthodox Jews continued to observe the Sabbath. But as we've said, God tells them, with respect to their land, the Sabbath in their land, and observance of it as He intended, it'll cease during the age of grace as punishment, which it has done. Because in the age of grace, God doesn't recognize Sabbath worship. I suppose you know that without me telling you. And then, secondly, the eschatological Sabbath, the Sabbath will be reestablished during the millennium for Israel after the church age. The eschatological Sabbath, or end time Sabbath, will be reestablished. It's Isaiah 66:23, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And of course, chapter 66 is in the context of the end times, as anyone who reads it can see plainly enough. That brings us to the sabbatical year. Sabbatical year. What is a sabbatical year? Well, as a Sabbath is the seventh day, so a sabbatical year is the seventh year. After the land has been cultivated and harvested for 6 years, it was to rest on the seventh year. The sabbatical year, the seventh year, the land was to rest. Now, what was the purpose in this? Well, first of all, that the poor might eat. The poor might eat. Exodus 23:10 and 11. Now, why letting the land rest the seventh year, would that enable the poor to eat? Well, we're told in Exodus 23:10 and 11 how that would work. And 6 years thou shalt sow the land, and shalt gather in the fruits thereof. But the seventh year thou shalt let it rest and be still, that the poor of thy people may eat. And what they leave, then the beasts of the field shall eat. In like manner thou shalt deal with thy vineyard and thine olive yard. So they were to sow and harvest and reap 6 years, and the seventh year they were to leave the land idle, their vineyards and their fruit trees, their olive yards. And then the poor could come into any field anywhere in Israel. And that's a lot of fields since they were farmers. And they could gather and reap and eat all year on it. Now, of course, God is realistic. He says in other passages that there will be no poor, but that's if they obey Him. They're not supposed to be any poor, but He's realistic. Like Jesus said, you'll have the poor with you always. In fact, He says that in the Old Testament. Even after He says there will be no poor among you, however, you'll have the poor with you. It's because He knows that some are not going to obey Him. It's like the promises that we read you out of the Word of God for healing or whatever, they only work if you obey Him. You see, if no one in this audience ever got healed, healing would still be true because God said it. And so with Israel, God is realistic. And so he said, let the land rest so that the poor can eat, gather, harvest, reap. Then what they leave, the beasts can eat. He said, what is left, the beasts will eat. So God takes care of the beasts. After all, the beasts had no trouble till man came in and took over their domain. You know about disappearing ducks and wildlife and deer because people keep multiplying and farming and building homes and damming up or cutting off streams. So wildlife has to be taken care of by God. This is the way he provided in Palestine. Then another reason why the sabbatical year, it's a rest for the land itself. Now any farmer knows the land has to rest after a while. That's why you see them with corn in a field for a few seasons, and then you'll find something else in that field and corn over in another field and whatever else they grow. So the land will rest. Leviticus 25, 1-7. You see, God even took that in consideration. Well, why didn't he just bless the land and cause it to be rich soil and full of grub worms that's supposed to make it rich and so on? Well, for the same reason that he made you in such a way you need so many hours rest each day, need to eat the right foods. He isn't going to protect your teeth or your health if you live on Big Macs and Cokes, French fries, junk food, if Big Mac will pardon the expression. No reflection on McDonald's, it's just a reflection on the fact that America eats out 50% of her meals, and as I've said so often, oh well, we won't repeat that one again. But see, God, if you eat out all the time and eat that junk, and there are few places where you can get good food, but if you eat that junk, he isn't going to keep you healthy in spite of neglecting certain laws of health. And so with the land, God knows it has to rest, or it will not continue to produce abundantly. So that's Leviticus 25. It's interesting how that God is smarter than people. They just worked the land to death until they learned they couldn't do it. And the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. You notice there are always Sabbaths unto the Lord. The land will keep a Sabbath. 6 years shalt thou sow thy field. 6 years thou shalt prune thine vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field, nor prune thy vineyard. That which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vineyard undressed, for it is a year of rest unto the Lord. Now they could eat of it, but they weren't to harvest it, is what he's saying. And the Sabbath of the land shall be food for you, not meat. King James, everything's meat. Food for you, for thee, and for thy servant, and for thy maid, and for thy hired servant, for thy stranger sojourner with thee, and for thy cattle, and the beasts that are in the land, shall all the increase thereof be food for them. So there's another reason why that we have the sabbatical year, is so the land will rest. Now, did it ever occur to you that if they were farmers, and they were, if they don't sow the 7th year, they won't have anything the 8th year? They'll have all right for the 6th year, but what are they going to eat on the 7th and 8th year? They're going to be 2 years without crops because they can't sow to the 8th. In fact, it'll be the 9th before they get anything. God is a supernatural God. If he said the land had to rest 2 years and you wouldn't even eat until, the 9th year, he's going to take care of it. Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25, verses 20 to 22. But if you say, this is God talking, if you say, then what shall we eat for the 7th year? You see, they asked the question because it was their stomachs. None of you were asking the question. If you say, what shall we eat the 7th year? Behold, we shall not sow nor gather in our increase. Look what God says. Then I will command my blessing upon you in the 6th year, and it shall bring forth fruit for 3 years. 6, 7, 8. So you can reap the 9th. He's going to command His blessing. I like that. We believe His word. We do what He says. He commands His blessing. He spoke to the land, the earth, the soil, and He said, produce 3 times as much this year. Oh, they were busy the 6th year because they had 3 times everything. 3 times the sheep, 3 times the cattle, 3 times the grapes, 3 times the grain, 3 times everything. You know, if they had really obeyed the Lord, which they didn't, they would have been the most prosperous nation on earth. And He said, no enemy will even get within your borders if you obey me. I mean, in all the days of the atom bombs, He would just command a wall, an invisible wall of fire, to be around Palestine. And no one could get in without God's permission. Well, He's going to command the land. You have 3 years. Now, there's some practical reasons besides the land needing a rest. That's going to give the people time to do other things. You see, the people could have other sources of income during these years, or especially the 7th year. You give them time to do other things. There are other things that would provide food. There's fishing, there's hunting, there's beekeeping, flocks, herds. Give them time to repair fences or barns or whatever they had. Make clothing, men clothing. So it gives them time to do other things. And God did not prevent them from having any other source of income or adding to their needs or desires or wants by other means. But the land could not be cultivated, or the vineyards or the fruit trees. Another purpose for this sabbatical year was that debts were canceled. All debts were canceled. Americans would have a hard time being Jews, because every 7th year, if somebody owed you, you had to cancel it. And what if they borrowed from you on the 6th year? Wow. Deuteronomy 15, 1-6 is called the Lord's release. On the sabbatical year, everything was released. Debts, slavery, whatever. Servitude. Every creditor canceled his debts. It was a time really for shouting if you owed anyone anything. At the end of every 7 years, thou shalt make a release. And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it, which means forgive it. Every creditor that has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it's called the Lord's release. Now, of a foreigner, a Gentile, us, thou mayest exact it again. But that which is thine with thy brother, thine hand shall release. And save when should really be translated as it is in the NASV. However, there shall be no poor among you, for the Lord shall greatly bless thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it. But only if you carefully hearken unto the voice of the Lord, to observe to do all these commandments. You see, we were told in Exodus 23 to take care of the poor. Here he says there'll be no poor. But you see, he says, if you obey me, which so many of them didn't do. So it's the year of release. Every creditor had to release debts, except with a Gentile, you could still exact the debt and interest. You couldn't charge interest of a Jewish brother, Israelite, but you could charge usury or interest of a Gentile. That is, an Israelite could. Now, a good question is, if you lend to somebody on the 6th year, or if a person leases something like a vineyard from you and is paying you yearly rental on it, a lot of this sort of thing went on. They could not sell their property. See, it had to stay in the family. That was the law. So that a person in a family in the tribe of Judah could not sell to somebody in Benjamin. But he could lease it, rent it, or sell himself into servitude. He owes a debt, he can't pay it. He says, all right, as Jacob did, I'll work for you 7 years or whatever. Well, you see, say he owed a man $10,000, and it's the 6th year when the debt arises. It's not long until he's going to get everything canceled. He says, well, I'll pay you $1 a week or $10 a week. He's not going to have to pay much of that debt back. That's why we've got this provision down in Deuteronomy 15, verse 9. Beware that there be not a thought in thy wicked heart, that is, if you got one, a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release, it's at hand. And then thine eye be evil against thy poor brother, and thou givest him nothing, and he cry unto the Lord against thee, and it shall be a sin unto thee. Thou shalt surely give him, and thine heart shall not be grieved when thou givest unto him, because that for this thing the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thy works, and all thou puttest thy hand to. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Now see, we read right back up in verse 4 that there be no poor. Then the verses intervening says, if you obey me. So being realistic, he goes right on in the same breath, as it were, and says, but the poor you will have with you. So what he's saying there, when a person owes you something, or if they're going to be indebted unto you, or if you want to lease, say, a vineyard next to yours and reap the fruit of that and all, and it's the 6th year, you don't wait until the 8th year before you do that, because you say, well, I'm going to have to give it back to him the 7th year. It's a year of release. See, a lot of debts would take place during the 6th year. And God says here, don't you have an evil heart and say, oh, it's a year of release next year, it's the 7th year, and then not help your brother if he has a need by lending to him. Lend to him anyway, even though you're going to have to forgive the debt if he doesn't pay it back. If it's next to the last day in December, December the 30th, you've got 1 day, and he has a need, you're going to help him, God says. But God says, I will bless you, and everything you do I will bless. So don't harden your heart. Well, anyway, God took care of that. You didn't raise that question either, but they did, because we don't have that sort of economy. Then a fourth thing, I guess it is, it took place during the sabbatical year. They read the law. During the Feast of Tabernacles, you stood up, and the entire law was read. Men, women, boys and girls, children, strangers, came to hear the law read, to learn the law, to learn how to obey. That's about all the teaching. And I recognize there are exceptions to that, because there were teaching priests and teaching prophets all around Israel. But how they taught, we have not an inkling in the Bible. They didn't hold meetings and all that, but they were teachers of the law, in the sense that I suppose if they were a priest living in a certain town and they were in need of understanding of certain aspects of the law, then they would teach the people. But here is the only reference really to what took place during the long life of Israel over the centuries. She gathered at the 3 feasts, and then at the Feast of Tabernacles, the law was read to everyone. That's just the reading. We're trying to spice it up a little here by telling you about all these other things, but they just read it. You're supposed to say, praise the Lord, hallelujah, glory to God. Well, that's all they had, so they were happy enough. I'm going to close with the year of Jubilee tonight, and we'll get to the pilgrimage feast later. The year of Jubilee. That isn't what it's called in the Bible, the year of Jubilee. It's called the year of the ram's horn. The year of the ram's horn. How'd you ever get Jubilee out of that? Well, we'll write it and I will show you. That says Yovel. That means a ram's horn. Y-O-B long E-L. Yovel. How do you ever get Jubilee out of that? I don't know. King James took that word and says, hey, that sounds like Jubilee. They come up with ideas in the King James Version like this more than once. It's called an onomatopoetic word. Don't ask me to spell it. I could. Onomatopoetic word. The word in Hebrew sounds like a word in English, so they adopt it. And so all through the Old Testament they talk about the year of Jubilee. But the Jew over there in Israel now doesn't talk about year of Jubilee. That's English. It's the year of the ram's horn, when they sound the horn. And it is the 50th year. After 7 sabbatical years, which is 49, the 50th year is the year of the ram's horn, Yovel. Shanat HaYovel. Shana year, remember? The year of the ram's horn. I'll give you the passages. Leviticus 25, Leviticus 27, Numbers 36, verse 4. Now, I won't read those passages. You can, but it's the year of the ram's horn, translated the year of Jubilee. I may look at one verse, give you an idea. Verse 9 of Leviticus 25 says, "Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound." Literally, thou shalt sound the ram's horns, what he said. King James says, "Thou shalt cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound." But he said, "Sound the ram's horn on the 50th year, on the 10th day of the 7th month, in the Day of Atonement." See, that's when it begins, on the Day of Atonement, the year of Jubilee. "And you shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty unto all the land, unto all the inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee unto you." Literally, it shall be a ram's horn unto you. That is, a blowing of the horn. Verse 10. So after 7 sevens, then everything got turned back to owners. If you had leased the land, if you had sold yourself into servitude, if you owed anyone anything, the year of Jubilee, everything got restored after 7 sabbaticals. And again, we've got 2 years in succession, so you've got the same problem, but God's going to provide. The 49th year is a sabbatical, so there's no work or no sowing or reaping. The 50th is going to be a year of Jubilee, so you're going to end up with 2 years, no sowing and reaping. Then you'll sow the 3rd year, and you're going to have 4 years provided just before the sabbatical year. How many believe God could do it? Amen. Well, He did. He did if they obeyed Him. Problem is they didn't. All right, the reasons for the year of Jubilee, we'll close with this. It tended to abolish poverty, because it gave unfortunate families, the poor, an opportunity to start over. If they owed anybody anything for any reason, everything was canceled. Again, it prevented large permanent accumulations of wealth and property. The Bible speaks against those Jews who joined field to field and house to house. So it prevented large and permanent accumulations of wealth. It didn't mean you couldn't be rich, but it discouraged people from getting rich off their brother. Thirdly, the year of the ram's horn prevented any true slavery from existing in Israel. Now, servitude abounded. We see it all through the Old Testament. But on the year of Jubilee, every slave was set free and could go back to his family. Everyone had sold himself into slavery. Of course, if he didn't want to, you remember there's a ceremony for that. If he wanted to stay with his master, then he took an awl and punched a hole in his ear against the doorpost, which wasn't such a bad operation because women are always getting their ears punched for earrings. Some women are. Then he was the master's. He belonged to the master. Another reason for the year of Jubilee, or ram's horn, it gave Israel time to do other things. Study the law, study the scriptures, fish, hunt, raise bees, all those other things. Again, it preserved the tribes and families the way God intended. It preserved the tribes and families the way God intended. Since in this way the same family would keep the property, and any servant or slave could go back now to his family. Every 50 years, all the slates were erased, everything cleared, all accounts cleared. God really had it planned out for Israel if she had obeyed him. He was realistic. He knew there would be poor and people who would sell themselves to their brother as servants and so forth to pay a debt. And people might, by mismanagement, lose their money, but they were never to lose their property. At least by the 50th year, it would revert back to the original family. And so when we take up again, we're going to deal with the 3 pilgrimage feasts: Passover, Pentecost, Feast of Tabernacles.